All right, so at this point, I don't know who wants to share their screen. We're going to talk about the equity guidance. Are we going to hear whoever, Ruthie or Tamika? I'm not sure.
Tamika, do you mind sharing your screen? I'm just going to share for a minute, and then Tamika's going to walk you through the content, and she's going to frame everything. Are you good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's good to see everybody, and thanks for having us in your space today. One of the things that I observed being in our forum last year and being part of my work in Michigan is being a part of our conference committee. So coming off our conference, at the national level, there was something that I observed, and it was really the kind of language that was being used when people were presenting. Some of it was the content would be really good, but some of the language behind it could be deficit. And so one of the things that we talked about in the equity work group was how can we provide our presenters with some guidelines, knowing that it's not going to be perfect. We're all on a journey. We're all in different places in this work with regards to using asset language and practices. How could we give some guidelines that would support presenters and beginning to move towards asset language or continue on their continuum of growing in that way? And so after having conversations, we had a subcommittee, and that was Tamika and myself. And we also provided what we did to Kent for feedback, and we just kept going through the revising. And then we also presented it to the work group and got feedback and just kept on revising. And now we're presenting it to this group. And it really is just to support speakers in having some ways to check off, am I being asked that? Am I centering equity as much as I know how into my content? So Tamika, I'm going to hand it over to you, but that's kind of the history leading us to some of these recommendations.
So I'm just going to take just a couple minutes to just talk through the key areas that we have under the equity and social justice considerations. Previously, there was still some attention to this. It was kind of a general paragraph talking about culture of responsiveness. And so we just wanted to elaborate a little bit more so that there's some level of continuity with respect to considerations for equity and the language that's used and how things are framed throughout the forum. So the first piece is just equity and social justice considerations. And again, as we continue to expand PBIS, considering and addressing issues of educational inequities for all students, considering a range of different identity markers is important. And we want to be clear about how we intentionally center equity in our conversations. And so we pulled from a few different resources, as is noted there. The first part is around making materials accessible. And I know Lucia also sent some slides around. I don't know if everyone got a chance to see those, but this is really about literally accessibility with respect to PowerPoints and how they are designed so that everyone is able to access them. This was really big when we were in virtual world, but still when we're in person, it's really a big consideration. And so there are a couple links here in terms of like font size and how to add descriptions when you're thinking about pictures, colors, all of those kinds of considerations. And so with each area, we tried to provide hyperlinks so that people can be linked to resources. The second piece is the use of critical language. And so here you see that we focus on using person first language. And so instead of disabled students, talking about students with disabilities, students with autism, minoritized students, I recognize that some individuals prefer to use identity first language, and we always honor that, right? But I think by default, we use person first and then let others define themselves and then go from there. And so it's not that we correct people if they say like I'm autistic, right? But it's just thinking about like how do we start and then allowing people to use identity first language, which is just as important. When you see minorities, sometimes people say, well, why do we say minoritized groups? And so we talk about minoritized groups as though racial and ethnically minoritized students make up a majority of the school population, they still don't have the power and the structures that are in place to be able to the power structure is still not there. And so they have been placed in minoritized positions. And that's why we refer to them as students from minoritized groups or students with marginalized or minoritized identities. And there are a range of terms that can be used. It's not that in all of these categories, it's to say that this is the term that you have to use, but it is considerations for the terms that we do use. When we talk about at-risk students, students who are placed at risk, right? So not talking about this innate being put at risk because of like your zip code, because of your race, because you have a disability that you're innately put at risk. And then when we talk about, I think we've exhausted this before, but like tier 2 students versus students who are receiving tier 2 services. And so again, just some recommendations. The list is definitely not exhaustive, but some of the things that I think when all of us were, or when we were looking at some of the presentations and listening to some of the presentations, these are some of the things that stood out. The next piece is providing content that supports a culturally affirming environment. And so here it's really about, and we've linked to the PBIS Culturally Responsive Field Guide that the Equity Work Group worked on over the last year. And there are a lot of great resources there. The point here is just considerations that reflect an asset, inclusive, and culturally affirming lens. And a lot of this is around how are we framing the content? How are we framing recommendations? And being able to talk about what's the context in which we are making recommendations, what's the content in which we have conducted our research, what's the content in which we have come up with the different constructs and describe the constructs. So it really is just thinking about like examples that are used, notes that reflect affirmative stance, and intentionally involving families and community members in meaningful partnerships, and really describing what that means. A lot of times we say include families, but really being explicit about what that looks like, because I think, I know for my own presentations, like sometimes we can give a lot of information, but don't always give concrete steps on how to move forward. And a lot of times that's what people are looking for. So thinking about how to do that in an inclusive way. I don't know why there's a blank page, but and then this is the other piece around defining equity and aligning content accordingly. And so here we talk about considering access, representation, meaningful participation, and high outcomes. And we provide a rationale as to why. And so when people are creating their presentations, we just want there to be consideration for who has access. And when we're talking about students and how they're performing, or we're talking about, for me, school climate, we're talking about student behavior, what do they have access to, and really being critical and thinking about that when we're making assumptions or talking about recommendations. Also, representation matters, right? We all keep saying that. And so making sure that the voices of all groups are elevated to the extent that's possible. And even if there isn't a diverse group, I think just being explicit about that, so that when someone else is using the recommendations or wants to use it, then there's an awareness that you might consider other factors with respect to that context. I think there's we all present a lot of great work. And so sometimes there are different nuances in how it might be replicated, and that's okay. But I think just acknowledging that is important. And then meaningful participation, just thinking about who is included, and high outcomes. So thinking about multiple data points. The last piece is focusing on improving systems. And we talk here about fixing systems, not students. And so the framing around, describing students as the problem. So consider like systemic norms and processes that inevitably affect students. So we're talking about, in this study or with this work, we find that Black students or students with disabilities underperform. Like not centering it on like the student who's underperforming, but thinking about the context in which they're underperforming and how we all contribute to that in different ways, and how to think about systemic supports. Because I think especially when we're talking to educators, it can be very myopic because they're thinking about like their students and can explain away like why this student didn't do well and why this student didn't do well. But to think about the collective experience and the collective history is really important in framing that. Linking negative student outcomes to deficit ideals, such as poverty frameworks that place blame on families and students. And so again, it's just thinking about like, how are we talking about and how are we framing the perceived problems or the perceived challenges. And lastly, applying a one-size-fits-all approach. And so again, this is where we continue to say context matters, and just being aware of that. And I think the overall takeaway is that I think all of us consider these things at different times, But what we want throughout the strands and throughout the presentations is there to be an explicit acknowledgement so that other people are considering these same things. And sometimes that's not always apparent because we assume that to be the case, but it's important to kind of point that out. And so this list is, again, not exhaustive, but just to provide some guidance and some additional resources for people as they start to construct their presentations.
And the only thing I would add, Tamika, because you did such a great job as usual, but when she was looking at the definition around equity, one of the things that we talked about was that everyone's talking about equity, but we know even if you're in one building, the way that people talk about and define equity can be vastly different. So at the center on our equity page, we have a definition that we've adopted. And so we were just kind of unpacking that and then just making sure when we say equity, this is what we mean. And so that way people still may have different ways that they're defining it, but at least they can see and do some alignment if possible with the ways in which we have been defining it with the work we've been doing. And by we, I mean we.